Hello and welcome to Ask the Professionals Q&A. My name is Heidi Sittelmeyer, and I am the Director of Online and Community Connections here at the Arthritis Foundation. I facilitate the Live Yes Connect group here in Los Angeles, and I'm a patient living with juvenile rheumatoid arthritis persisting into adulthood, plus also a couple of other comorbidities as well. Ask the Professionals Q&A is a video series where we solicit questions from the arthritis patient community, and we bring them to leading experts to help get our questions answered. Today, I have the great pleasure of having Dr. Alfred Kim with us. He is an adult rheumatologist at Barnes Jewish Hospital and an assistant professor of medicine at Washington University School of Medicine, where he also directs the lupus clinic and co-directs the biobanking care for the Division of Rheumatology. He has an independent research program broadly addressing unmet needs in patients with systemic lupus. And more recently, he started the COVID REP, and there's a lot of letters here, so COVID-RIPAD study, examining the effectiveness and impact that COVID-19 vaccine has on systemic autoimmune patients. So Dr. Kim, are you ready?
Yes, I'm ready, and thank you for that introduction, Heidi.
All right. So let me ask you, so what does COVID-A rapid mean?
So I pronounce it Covirapad. It's been pronounced many different ways, but it stands for COVID vaccine responses in patients with autoimmune diseases. And it's looking at what happens with mRNA vaccination in the setting of immunosuppression, but within the context of systemic autoimmune diseases. So this includes rheumatic diseases, but also diseases such as multiple sclerosis and inflammatory bowel diseases.
Fantastic. Thank you for explaining, because I obviously stumbled over all the. So let's jump right in. So our first question from our patient community is, I experienced a horrible flare after my second COVID vaccine last year. My doctors have been pushing me to get a booster ever since because of my immune status, but I'm worried it will trigger another flare. Is it possible that the vaccine caused my flare? And what do you recommend?
So this is a great question. And this is a question we get with some frequency, because I think there are certainly people, and certainly within the published literature, anywhere between 5 to 8% of patients with rheumatic diseases will flare after vaccination. The other aspect here too, that's a bit nuanced, is adverse events that mimic flares due to the vaccine. Of course, to the patient, it doesn't really matter which is which. There's still there's symptoms, there's a reduction in quality of life. So what I've been informing my patients is I have actually not been forcing them to get the booster, even though there are substantial advantages. The real issue here is whether or not that patient is actually ready to be able to handle those adverse events or flare. I think my position has changed now simply because we have Evulsheld, which is the pre-exposure prophylaxis with the monoclonal antibodies. It's 2 shots, 1 in each butt cheek. But these antibodies that have been identified in people who recovered from COVID-19, and also then identified by AstraZeneca as being broadly neutralizing. In other words, they can bind to virtually every variant that's been identified to date and be able to block its infection, at least within a culture system, which then translates to reduced infections in people. So this is the reason why things like Evulsheld are so critical for our rheumatic disease patients, including patients with arthritis, because they really help give you a huge safety net in case your vaccine responses were not great in the first place, or you can't optimize them because of the side effects from the booster shots.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm part of the Johns Hopkins study. So
yes, Julie Pak, yes.
And my first response was a very low response. So.
Yeah, and that's actually kind of true across the board, especially with methotrexate users. There's some great data from the Netherlands by Laura Boekel's group that has shown that for whatever reason, methotrexate seems to blunt that first vaccine response, but once you get the second, then it goes back up.
Breathed a sigh of relief when I saw those second set of numbers.
Exactly.
So our next question from our community is, many immunocompromised patients have already received a fourth dose. What are your recommendations about a fifth dose? And then should patients get one now and wait until another surge, or wait until?
Yeah, that's another great question because, I think the same way. The more is better. I think there are always points of diminishing returns, though. I'm not saying that you're necessarily increasing risk, but really how much more are we maximizing benefit? I think that right now, having a total of 4 doses may be sufficient for the vast majority of people. And this really includes people who are on drugs such as mycophenolate, mostly used in the transplant world, sometimes used in the autoimmune world, particularly for lupus patients, and sometimes other systemic diseases that are going to be autoimmune in nature. But because this medication, mycophenolate, is really potent and has been shown across the world in multiple studies that it can really destroy vaccine responses. But the more that these people get vaccinated, they can actually get up to a good response. So I think with that, those people in particular, the fourth dose is absolutely critical. Certainly for the rest of the immunosuppressed population, I think most people will gain optimal benefits certainly after the third dose. The fourth dose provides probably another safety cushion for them. All right. The one group, though, that we're still having trouble with are people who have been on B-cell depleting agents such as rituximab, used in rheumatoid arthritis patients, used in vasculitis patients, and also lupus patients. Here, I think there needs to be additional work trying to figure out how to best time the dose from the last time you received rituximab, because it's clear that once you get rid of these B cells, which eventually are going to make your antibodies, obviously you're not going to have good responses. And these antibodies appear to be really important. So, we need to do a lot more work in the research and to figure out how can we safely protect them, at least through vaccinations, that doesn't require things like Evulsheld.
Thank you. Our next question. Do patients with recent COVID-19 infection need to seek out an additional dose?
Yeah, so this is another really good question. There's a theoretical, so immunologically, we say that each time you survive an encounter with spike protein, whether it's going to be through vaccination, which is the safest way to get it, or through infection, which is a much less safe way to get it, this acts as boosters regardless. All right. And certainly we know that there are people with hybrid immunity who've had these mixed type of encounters with spike protein that do really well in terms of their immune responses. So the question is, let's say you had 2 doses, maybe even a third dose, and then subsequently got infected, right? You had COVID-19. Then the question is, do you need to get that fourth dose? I think first thing is that the immune response from the COVID infection likely is driving a long-term protective response similar to vaccination. So we think that the dosing interval may be you may be able to delay it quite a bit longer than just between the third and fourth dose of vaccine, just because this acts kind of as a pseudo fourth dose. Now, let's say we extend this out, it's 6 months later. Do you happen to get the fourth dose? I still think that there is benefit to getting that fourth dose, largely because the immune response becomes very diverse, and that diversity helps you actually anticipate future variants. So the more you encounter that spike protein, again, vaccination is the best way to get it, but again, infection can mimic it in a very similar way. That allows you to be able to get that immune response super, super broad to the point where additional variants that may pop up next year, you already have responses against it. And again, the other issue too is within the context of some people with immunosuppression, especially the more potent ones. Each time you see that antigen, that spike protein, it just gets better and better and better. So especially for those people, I would definitely pursue the fourth dose later in the year.
Thank you. Now our next question. What does the data say about vaccine efficacy for patients with autoimmune diseases? Is there anything patients can do to increase vaccine efficacy or effectiveness?
Right. Yeah. So the question of whether or not the vaccines are even protective in the first place is the data is just starting to come out. There was initial reports that came out from Jeff Sparks and Zach Wallace's effort at the Mass Gen Brigham in Boston, where they showed that the people who ended up being hospitalized were ones that ended up being on more potent immunosuppressions that had the worst vaccine responses. So this goes in line with a lot of the lab data that has been generated, suggesting that with the other immunosuppressants, it is not so potent to the point where it can't protect. Now, there's additional data that has recently come out, particularly from the state of Michigan. And again, Jeff Wallace, Namraj Singh, and Jeff Sparks, Namraj Singh, and Zach Wallace has a nice little summary of it, a commentary in the Lancet Rheumatology that, again, has basically confirmed a lot of the similar things that we found that most people, not all, but most people on immunosuppression do mount protective responses. And again, this matches up with the lab data that our group and others globally have generated. So this is actually very reassuring for a couple of reasons. First of all, at least within the autoimmune population, the medications that you're on that most likely wasn't really held initially, it hasn't really penalized too many people, right? There's a difference between what's enough versus what's perfect. Everyone looks at, oh, I need to be perfect. The reality is we just need to be enough, all right? And it looks like most people have enough of an immune response that's protective. But secondly, it has helped us refine the people who are definitely at that high risk. B-cell depleted people, people on mycophenolate, and also certain people on steroids, right? Which is kind of our evil, twin in rheumatology. Those three populations definitely are at the highest risk of having issues downstream. It also happens to be these people have the highest risk of progressing to severe COVID if they happen to catch it. So again, this was a major problem a year ago. We do have ways to mitigate now with Evulsheld and Paxlovid. So again, the situation is better, but we haven't come up with a perfect solution for those populations.
Thank you. All right, so our next question. What does the data say about safety and efficacy of the vaccine for children with autoimmune diseases?
So there's virtually nothing out there for children. There are some very small studies that demonstrate that show similar numbers in terms of immune responses, not necessarily efficacy. Those protection data is still a little early, but certainly similar vaccine type responses that are measured in the lab to adults. All right, so again, that's reassuring. And also in terms of side effects, it's relatively similar in terms of percentages compared to adults. And again, most of these are non-US studies. I think there are a couple of them from Asia, and I believe there's one in Europe. There's a large clinical trial funded by the NIH and the division within it, the NIAID, called the ACV01 trial. It's a huge study with a pediatric subset to it. So this is going to give us a lot of answers, but it's going to take a little bit of time. Again, the vaccine rolled out to the pediatric population, at least parts of it, late. So there's going to be a lag before we have some clear answers there. So keep your ears to the ground.
All right, a little patience for our patients.
A little patience for patients.
All right, so you pointed to this question already, but let me see if you want to add anything else to this. Do arthritis drugs decrease the effectiveness of vaccines?
Yeah, so again, this is a great question. Arthritis drugs certainly can decrease can generate suboptimal immune responses. But again, is it enough versus perfect? The breakthrough infection data that I mentioned before, in other words, people who've got infected after vaccination, it seems to not necessarily favor, in other words, it isn't high in the people that are generally on drugs like methotrexate, TNF inhibitors. There are some, again, increases in the B-cell depleted patients, and again, the mycophenolate and steroid users. So I think that in general, a lot of the arthritis medicines that are out there certainly decrease the response a little bit from optimal, but that's not enough though to basically prevent infection, inhibit prevention. All right, so it's still sufficient. And again, that's really reassuring.
Fantastic. And going along this line of the conversation, how important is the timing between doses for COVID vaccines?
Yeah, so this is a very nuanced answer, and I think we've learned a lot because of especially the mRNA vaccines, given its timing. We know, at least in the methotrexate users, and we touched on this a little bit earlier, that if you delay that second dose, you're living in a world where your antibody levels are really, really low compared to other immunosuppressive medications. A little bit surprising that it's not across the board. There's something unique that methotrexate is doing. And the reason why we know this is because in Europe and in Canada and also the UK, that they had delays in administration population-wide of the second mRNA dose versus the US. But once they got that second dose, their responses were able to get up to much higher levels. So I think, at least for those first 2 doses of the mRNA vaccines, for people certainly on methotrexate, we could probably extend it to general immunosuppressed people. They need to be dosed relatively close to one another. Now, after that, though, you want the immune response to mature. And what I mean by that is the immune response that occurs after vaccination tends to linger on for months, not just weeks or days, but months afterwards. And this was demonstrated mostly in immunocompetent people by a colleague of ours here at Washington University named Ali Elabedi. So his group found that immune responses in the lymph nodes closest to the area that got vaccinated, they're still going on 7 months after vaccination. But again, during that time period, the antibody response is blossoming. Right. So I think this allows us to delay that administration of the 3rd dose and the 4th dose, because again, that length of that immune response from the prior vaccination is remarkably long. And so that, again, we're going to still learn and fine tune this, because we may find nuances depending on the type of medications or combinations of medications. So again, another to be determined.
All right, thank you. All right, our next question is, what is known about the efficacy of Evulsheld for immune-compromised patients? Should patients opt for this treatment instead of additional boosters or both?
Yeah, so this is a good question. There's a good technical point here. The FDA EUA for Evulsheld clearly states that Evulsheld does not replace vaccination or boosters. So really, the decision here is that we need to vaccinate first, then get Evulsheld. There are reasons why you may not need additional, like a booster, simply because you've had adverse events before. All right, and so that gets you out of that clause. All right. So, but generally speaking, the vaccine needs to occur first, and then Evulsheld. Once you get Evulsheld, the data for immunosuppressed has not been published yet. There's been a series from the Cleveland Clinic led by Len Calabrese and his daughter Cassie that's being reviewed right now, but they put out a preprint showing that it appears to be protective. So largely in the B cell depleted people, the percentages of people that ended up needing hospitalization because of COVID-19 was the same percent, a very low percent, compared to the immunocompetent people. All right, so that's actually really reassuring. The other immunosuppressed people. That's really reassuring, because again, the B cell depleted people are definitely the highest risk. So once they get Evulsheld, that risk goes down to the same as other immunosuppressed people. So that tells you a lot about how effective Evulsheld can be. Now, in terms of total numbers, again, since it's just rolled out, say in January, February, and again, depending on the region, and some people still don't have access to it, which is a major issue. We'll have better ideas in the summer, fall, as we increase the time that we are able to accumulate cases, if that's the case. So we're going to try to look at it ourselves here, but we're seeing infection rates drop a lot with Evulsheld. So it's good.
Awesome. Very promising. Awesome.
Mm-hmm.
When given an additional booster, should patients opt the same COVID vaccine or mix and match?
Oh, yeah. So that's a great question too. I mean, these are the exact questions that we are thinking about in the research world. So obviously your readership is, highly intelligent. I would say that mixing and matching, there are some data in people who are not immunosuppressed. It may increase the bar a little bit. It could optimize things a little bit better. Again, whether or not that's necessary is a good question. It seems like there's no real harm if your third or fourth shot is an mRNA one, regardless of which one, if it's Pfizer or Moderna. If you've had mRNA initially and then you happen to get, not that you can get in the US anymore, does just say J&J, right? That doesn't give you the same optimization as getting the Pfizer or Moderna as that third shot. So I think that's the only caveat here in terms of mixing and matching. Not so relevant in the US, but having that mRNA, one of the two as a third or fourth dose, that seems to be just fine. And which one it is, again, the ACV01 trial is looking at some of the mixing and matching, but in our experience, when our preliminary look at the data, we haven't seen much differences.
Well, thank you, Dr. Kim, for your willingness to tackle these questions and
Pleasure.
rapid fire style here. So we appreciate you helping educate and our patient community and really providing us with some sound, up-to-the-minute guidance on the evolving world around COVID vaccines. So I hope those of you who have joined us today really enjoy this episode of Ask the Professionals, and I invite you to come back and join the conversation at arthritis.org. The Arthritis Foundation has an awesome abundance of programs and services, including our patient education webinars, podcasts, our connect groups, the online community, and our Insights program, and our VIM app, which is our newest tool in our toolkit to empower you to live your best life with arthritis. So please visit us at arthritis.org. Thank you.